That is stonewalling. That's a failure of leadership. And that is why I've called for your resignation. And if I don't get an answer to these questions, I don't want an applause. Please don't do that for me. If I don't get an answer to these questions, if I don't get an answer that you've had a month to respond to, and the remaining ones, as of today, I'll be informing leadership that I'm putting a hold on any en-bloc nominations until I get a response.
That is a Republican United States Senator on the record in a Senate hearing, calling for the resignation of a Trump cabinet secretary and threatening to shut down nominations. Not a Democrat, a Republican, and a senator who supports deportation, supports law enforcement, and supported Trump's election. And what he laid out before that moment is a point-by-point case built on 4 charges, each one more consequential than the last. I need to walk you through something that happened in a Senate hearing this week because the coverage so far is focused on the headline. A Republican called for Noem's resignation without fully unpacking the substance of what was actually said. And the substance is far more damaging than the headline. This was not a partisan attack. This was not a Democrat scoring political points. This was a Republican senator who opened by praising Trump's election, who acknowledged the disaster of the Biden border policy, who called himself unapologetically pro-law enforcement, and who then spent the next several minutes methodically laying out a case that Kristi Noem has failed at her job, maybe violating federal law, is obstructing her own inspector general, and is getting people killed through operational incompetence. That is not opposition. That is accountability from inside the president's own party. And the 4 charges he laid out, taken together, paint a picture of a department in crisis that the administration cannot spin away. This is where things get serious. Here are the 4 charges, and I want you to understand why each one escalates in severity.
Who does Tom Homan work for? You or the president?
The president.
Okay. Why is that? Because I believe the president recognized that you weren't getting it done in Minneapolis.
Charge number 1, the Minneapolis disaster and the deaths of Ms. Good and Mr. Pretty. The senator went directly at the ICE operation in Minneapolis that has become the single most damaging law enforcement story of the Trump administration. He didn't mince words. He said, quote, Ms. Good and Mr. Pretty probably should not have been shot in the face and in the back. He then made a distinction that carries enormous political weight. He said, quote, we're beginning to get the American people to think that deporting people is wrong. It's the exact opposite. The way you're going about deporting them is wrong. Read that carefully. This is a Republican senator who fully supports deportation, telling the administration that their methods are so incompetent that they are turning public opinion against the very policy the Republican base elected Trump to implement. He's not saying stop deporting people. He's saying you're doing it so badly that you're making deportation politically toxic. And then he connected it to Stephen Miller directly. He said he'd heard reports that Miller was the one who characterized the Minneapolis situation as a domestic terrorist event where 2 people lost their lives. He referenced the culture that Miller is, in the senator's words, quote, aiding and abetting. He then asked Noem directly, who does Tom Homan work for, you or the president? Noem confirmed the president. The senator's response was immediate and pointed. He said, quote, because I believe the president recognized that you weren't getting it done in Minneapolis and you're putting us further away from pointing to this. A Republican senator just told a Republican cabinet secretary on camera that the president himself had to route around her because she was failing. That is an extraordinary assessment from inside the administration's own coalition.
Thank you.
Senator,
no,
that $100,000 only had to do with...
And I will hold the clock until I finish.
Consider what that actually means in practice. Charge number 2, the FEMA failure and the potential violation of federal law. The senator presented visual evidence in the hearing, a comparison chart showing FEMA disaster response under Trump's first administration versus FEMA response under Noem's current leadership. The difference, according to the senator, was dramatic and damning. He held up both charts and asked simply, quote, which one would you like to have? He cited a specific policy that Noem has implemented requiring anything over $100,000 in FEMA disbursements to go through her desk for personal approval. For context, North Carolina is dealing with a $60 billion disaster. The senator pointed out that Noem's largest disaster experience in South Dakota was approximately $500 million, 100th the scale of what she's now responsible for. He said directly, quote, "I'm convinced you can't do it." And then Noem tried to respond. She started to explain the $100,000 policy, and the senator cut her off immediately, saying, quote, "I will hold the clock until I finish." He wasn't interested in her explanation. He was building a record. And then he escalated to the most consequential legal statement of the entire hearing. He said, quote, "The Homeland Security Act of 2002 expressly prohibits the Secretary of Homeland Security from restricting or diverting FEMA resources from the agency's mission. Based on your disaster response, the chart that I just showed you, I have reason to believe that you're violating the law, either knowingly or unknowingly." A Republican senator just accused a Republican cabinet secretary of potentially violating federal law. Not policy disagreement, not strategic criticism, a specific legal statute, the Homeland Security Act of 2002, cited by name, with the accusation that Noem's FEMA policies may be in direct violation of it. He then announced he would be submitting questions for the record, under penalty of perjury, to determine the total amount of FEMA reimbursements currently being held by DHS, awaiting Noem's personal approval. Under penalty of perjury, that means if Noem or her department provides inaccurate answers, there are criminal consequences. This is not political theater. This is a senator building a legal record. Here's the piece of this puzzle that's been missing from most coverage. Charge number 3, the Inspector General obstruction. The senator submitted into the record a letter from the Office of Inspector General, citing 10 separate instances under Noem's leadership where the OIG had been misled and prevented from pursuing investigations they deemed critically important. He then asked a question that anyone who has worked in government oversight understands the weight of. He said, quote, "Does anybody have any idea how bad it has to be for the OIG and this agency to come out and do this publicly?" That question is not rhetorical. Inspectors general are internal watchdogs. They are specifically designed to operate quietly within the system to identify and correct problems before they become public crises. When an IG goes public, when they issue a formal letter documenting that they have been misled and obstructed, it means the internal channels have failed. It means they have tried to do their job through proper channels and been blocked so thoroughly that they had no choice but to go on the record. 10 instances. Not 1, not 2, 10 documented cases where Noem's department misled or obstructed their own inspector general. The senator called it what it is, quote, "stonewalling and a failure of leadership." And this is the charge that directly preceded his resignation call. The obstruction of the inspector general is the charge that, in the senator's assessment, makes Noem's position untenable. And that brings us to the critical question. Charge number 4, the pattern of failed judgment. This is where the senator stepped back from specific policy failures and addressed something more fundamental. Noem's judgment as a leader. He referenced her book, in which she described killing a 4-month-old dog because it was behaving badly during a hunting trip. The senator, who trains dogs himself, said directly that a 4-month-old dog is essentially a teenager in dog years, that the behavioral issues were the result of inadequate training, not the dog's character. He told her, quote, "You are a farmer. You should know better." And then he addressed the part that distressed him most, not the act itself, but how Noem framed it. He said, quote, "And then you have the audacity to go into a book and say it's a leadership lesson about tough choices." The senator is making a pointed argument here. Killing the dog was a failure of preparation and patience. Framing it as leadership was a failure of self-awareness. And he connected that judgment pattern directly to her handling of North Carolina disaster response. Her premature public statements made for the expedient of social media, and her persistent inability to acknowledge mistakes in Minneapolis. He said, quote, "The fact that you can't admit to a mistake, which looks like under investigation, it's going to prove that MS Good and Mr. Pretty probably should not have been shot in the face and in the back." The inability to admit error. The inability to learn from failure. The instinct to frame poor decisions as tough leadership. The senator is arguing that this is not a series of isolated mistakes. It is a pattern of judgment that makes Noem fundamentally unfit for the position she holds. Let me walk you through the significance of what happens next, because the senator didn't just criticize, he announced specific consequences with specific timelines. First, he has formally called for Noem's resignation. That call is now in the Senate record. Second, he announced that if he does not receive answers to questions he submitted a month ago, questions Noem has already failed to answer, he will place a hold on all en bloc nominations. That means the administration's ability to confirm appointees through the Senate gets blocked by a member of their own party. Third, he announced that if he does not receive responses within 2 weeks, he will deny quorum and markup in as many committees as he can. That is a procedural weapon that can grind Senate business to a halt. A single determined senator can cause enormous disruption when they choose to use the tools available to them. And this senator is now publicly committed to using those tools on a specific timeline with specific triggers. Here's what it all comes down to. These 4 charges, the Minneapolis deaths and operational incompetence, the FEMA failure and potential federal law violation, the Inspector General, obstruction, and the pattern of failed judgment are not coming from the opposition. They are coming from a Republican who opened his statement by saying, quote, "One of the reasons President Trump won a year and a half ago is because people were sick," end quote. Tired of a Democratic administration's open border policy, they are coming from a senator who declared himself, quote, "unapologetically pro-law enforcement," and who counts every sworn officer in Homeland Security as people he supports. When criticism comes from the other side, it can be dismissed as partisan. When criticism this specific, this documented, and this consequential comes from inside the coalition, it cannot be dismissed at all. The senator drew a clear line between supporting what the administration is trying to do and condemning how Noem is doing it, and in one of the most striking moments of the hearing, he reminded the room that while the January 6 rioters, the people he called, quote, thugs, have been pardoned, the Capitol police officers who defended the building that day still haven't received a plaque of recognition. That contrast was not accidental. It was a Republican senator telling his own party that their priorities are inverted. This story is far from over. The senator has set a 2-week clock. If Noem's department doesn't provide the answers he's demanded, answers they've already had a month to prepare, the procedural consequences begin. Nomination holds, quorum denials, committee shutdowns, all from a Republican. Meanwhile, the Inspector General's letter documenting 10 instances of obstruction is now part of the Senate record. The FEMA performance comparison is now part of the Senate record. The legal citation of the Homeland Security Act of 2002 and the accusation that Noem may be violating it is now part of the Senate record. The direct statement that 2 people in Minneapolis probably should not have been shot in the face and in the back is now part of the Senate record. And the Charlotte's Web investigation that the senator requested a month ago and still hasn't received an answer on that unanswered request is now part of the Senate record too. Every one of these statements was made under the rules of the Senate on camera for the permanent record. They cannot be deleted, retracted, or memory hold. They exist, and they will be cited in every future confirmation hearing, every oversight investigation, and every accountability debate for as long as Noem holds this position. The clock is running, the questions are on the record, and a Republican senator has told the administration in the clearest possible terms that the answers had better come or the consequences will.